GameSci.com. GameSci.com.
Howdy ho, neighbors. It's time for a lesson on the while loop and flowchart. Loops are control flow statements. Just like if and if else are control flow statements, while loops and for loops are control flow statements. They're a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to start with a generic example and a diagram called a flowchart that shows you how they work. While something is true or false, if you follow this arrow over here, anything that is true and false is evaluated in a diamond on a flowchart. And what we're saying here is if this statement is true, we will go down and execute these statements down there. As a true statement, consistent with the if and the if-else statement, we are going to go inside the block and execute the statements in the block. Follow this arrow and we're going to execute this. This could be 1, this could be 3, this could be 10 statements, but we're going to execute the indented code below the while because the condition was true. Here's where it's different though. When you reach the end of the indented code, what's going to happen is we're going to loop back up and do it all over again. That's why these are called loops. They spin around in a circle, or they loop in a circle until this condition goes false. Next time through, we follow this arrow down here, we come around, we come back to the true-false statement. If it is true a second time, we will fall through and execute the statements. We execute the statements in the while block because the condition above it was true. When we reach the end of the block, the end of the indented code, we will loop back up and go do it all over again. We're true again, which means we're going to execute the statements in the block. A while loop is the repeated execution of a block of code. We're going to execute it multiple times. When we reach the end of the statements, we will loop back up and try it again. You see what I'm talking about, a loop? It spins in this code and repeats it over and over again. When we reach the end of the indented code, we loop back up and do it again. Finally, or eventually, we reach a point where this condition goes to false. When this condition goes to false, we will exit the loop, which means skip the indented code and pick up below the while loop the non-indented code after the while loop. Now that was very generic. Let's look at a real example of a while loop with variables and actual executable code. Welcome to the while loop. This is a control flow statement. Why? Because it controls the flow of the program. It controls the path that the program will execute. We'll set up a variable count. This is called the iteration variable. It will control how many times this loop spins, and we'll set it up with a 0 as the initial value. With a 0 as the value, 0 less than 3 evaluates to true. Well, what does true mean? True means we will execute the indented code. Go inside the while loop and execute all lines of code that are indented. We'll print in the loop and it shows up here on the output. After we print that, we will go to the next line of code that's indented and do a count equals count plus 1, and the variable count changes to 1. Remember, count is what we call the iteration variable. It controls how many times we spin in the loop. When we reach the end of the indented code, we will spin back up. There's sort of a invisible trampoline here that says, okay, you hit this point, bounce back up to here and evaluate the while again. This time count is equal to 1, so 1 less than 3 is still a true statement. We're going to go inside the code and execute the indented code. We'll print in the loop a second time. We'll continue to execute the indented code, and count equals count plus 1 will update the count variable to a 2. Spinning at the end of the loop back up to execute the while statement again. Again, there's sort of an invisible trampoline. Once you finish the indented code, bounce back up and execute the while loop again. 2 less than 3 is still a true statement. As a true statement, what does that mean? Go inside and execute the code. Here we go, jump inside, we print in the loop for a third time. Basically, in the loop is going to print every time the while statement is true. Count equals count plus 1, we bump that to 3. Things are going to change now. We hit our invisible trampoline there at the end of the indented code, we bounce back up to the while. But this time, Count less than or equal to 3 evaluates to 3 less than 3. 3 less than 3 is a false statement. As a false statement, we will jump out of the while loop and pick up the code after the while loop, the non-indented code after the while loop. That loop is done. There's 3 important things you have to understand about a while loop. Count is what we call the iteration variable, and there's 3 important things you have to do to that variable. The first thing you have to do to the count iteration variable is you've got to initialize it. Got to give it a starter value. The second thing you have to do to the iteration variable is you have to test the iteration variable. Count less than 3 is a true-false condition. We have to test that variable to see if the loop should execute. The third most important thing you have to do inside that loop is you have to change that iteration variable. Count equals count plus 1 will make sure that this eventually goes to false. We don't want to spin forever in this loop. That would be called an infinite loop. We have to change the iteration variable inside the loop. Now, if you do those 3 things, initialize the iteration variable correctly, test the iteration variable, and change the iteration variable, your loop should work just fine. If your loop does not work properly, it's probably one of those 3 points that is messing up your loop. The second type of loop that Python supports is called a for loop. Once again, we'll do this with a flowchart first so you can see how it works, and then we'll look at real code. A for loop, of course, is another control flow statement. Any statements that control the path the program takes, any statements that select what code executes next is called a control flow statement. And the for loop is 100% a control flow statement. Now, the interesting thing about a for loop in a Python is they're easier to set up and do, but they're more complicated to understand because there's a lot of hidden stuff that happens under the covers. So we'll try and explain what does Python do for you automatically with the for loop. Very generic for item in range 3. The first thing that Python does is it initializes the variable item. Whatever the variable name here is, it will initialize it. By default, item will start with 0. Unless told otherwise, item always starts with the default value of 0. Then we'll evaluate, is item equal to 0 in range from 0 to 3. The range 3 command says I want to execute over a range starting at 0 all the way to 3, not including 3. Exclude 3. So since 0 is in range from 0 to 3, not including 3, this evaluates as a true-false statement. Recall from the while loop, we had this diamond-shaped thing in the flowchart that evaluated a true or false. Well, we still have that true-false condition, but this time the true or false is the item in range? 0 is in range, so it will return a true and execute the statements in the for loop. A while loop has a true-false condition at the top while something is true or false. A for loop has a condition that becomes, is the item in range? If the item is in range, it evaluates to true and the code executes. Since the item was in range, it was a true statement, we will execute the block of statements. Notice that statements here is plural. It could be 1 or 3 or any number of lines. As long as they're indented, they will execute while the item is in range. This is a loop, however, and when you reach the end of the loop, what do? We hit our invisible trampoline and we bounce back up. Once the indented code is done executing, we bounce back up and execute the code again. Again, there's some stuff that's going on automatically that Python does for you. It makes it simpler to write the code, but a little harder to understand what's going on. I put in my flowchart here a little change. Before it comes back up to this diamond, it's going to change item. It's going to bump item to the next thing in the list. Item equals item plus 1. Item goes to 1. Item automatically goes to the next value in the range. We set up we want a range over 0 to 3. We will bump to the next item in range. The next item is 1. Is item equal 1 in range from 0 to 3? Well, it sure is. 1 is in the proper range. Remember, we're excluding 3, so this is still a true statement. That means our condition, our true-false statement that's controlling the loop is true. When this is true, what do? We fall through and execute the block of statements. And that's what this arrow is showing here. Since my item is in range, we are going to execute the block of statement. Is item in range? Is true or false question. 1 is in the proper range. We're going to execute the code in the block. The statements inside the for loop will execute. Notice that statements is plural. It could be multiple statements. Anything that's indented below the for loop will execute. We'll loop back up and do it again. Item equals item plus 1. That'll bump item to 2. Item is just going to sequence through the range. Item automatically goes to the next value, and 2 is that value. Is item equal to 2 in range from 0 to 3? Yes, it is. That is a true statement. 2 is in range from 0 to 3. If the item is in range, that's a true-false question. That evaluates to true. We will execute the code in the for loop. And the code executes in the for loop. We loop back up to do the for loop again. And we bump item. Again, see that little change right there? This is sort of a hidden thing that Python does for us. It bumps item to the next value in the range. Item plus 1, which is the default behavior, will bump it to 3. Item automatically goes to the next value in the range 3, but guess what? 3 is not in range. With item equal to 3, is it in range from 0 to 3? No, it is not. The way the range function works is this is the upper limit. It does not include 3. So when you do not include 3 in the range, this is a false statement. Is item in range is a true-false question. 3 is in the range from 0 to 2 is a false reply. So we are going to leave the loop. You can see this arrow here says, oh, I'm not in range anymore. Let's skip past the for loop. Execute the code below the for loop that is not indented. You can see it over on the flowchart. We will exit the diamond in this direction and skip past the block of statements and continue on past the for loop. There's the generic example of the for loop. Let's look at a real example with variables and actual executable code. Here's a for loop, a simple for loop. We'll set up a variable called loop and a variable called sum. Looks like a loop will be my control variable, the one that decides how many times we spin through the loop. Let's initialize sum with the value 0 in it, and you can see a 0 shows up in our variable sum. For loop in range 4, 1, -1. The range function in Python is very powerful. It can do a range over any sequence of numbers you want. We're going to say range indicates start at 4, stop before we get to 1, and every time change the range by -1. So this says don't add 1 to the range every time through the loop. Subtract 1 from the range every time through the loop. We'll start our loop at 4, and you can see a 4 shows up in the loop variable here. Is loop equal to 4 in range from 4 to 1? Yes, it is. 4 is in the range from 4 to 1. By the way, that excludes 1. That is a true statement. A while loop has a true-false condition at the top, while something is true or false. With a for loop, the condition becomes, is the loop in range? Is that a true-false statement? And the answer in this case is true. 4 is in the proper range, so we will go inside and execute the code in the for loop. Sum equals sum plus 3, and the variable sum bumps to the value we want, 3. At the end of the loop, when we hit code that is not indented, we will hit our invisible trampoline and jump back up to the for loop and do it again. First thing we adjust is the value in loop. Loop equals loop plus -1. What's going on there? Our answer is 3. Loop is going to change to the value 3. Why did loop change to a 3? Range indicates change by -1. That third parameter to the range says subtract 1 from loop every time. So we'll subtract 1. And it turns out if loop is equal to 3, is that in range from 4 to 1? That excludes 1. That is a true statement. So our for loop is true, which means we execute the code. Is the loop in range is the question that you have to ask at the top of the loop. And 3 definitely is in the range. Execute the code in the loop. Sum equals sum plus 3. We'll change our sum to value 6. After we do that, it's time to spin back up and execute this code again. When you reach the end of the indented code, we come back up here and evaluate the loop again. Loop equals loop plus minus 1 sends it down to 2. Range indicates change by minus 1. This third parameter of the range says we're going to go down. We're going to loop backwards, 4, 3, 2, not forwards. Loop contains the value 2. When we evaluate, is that in range? We ask, is loop equal to 2 in range from 4 to 1? The loop with the value 2 is in the proper range. This is a true statement. What you have to ask yourself at the top of the for loop is the loop in range? If it's a true statement, we will execute the code in the loop. And 2 is definitely in the range. Once again, we execute sum equals sum plus 3, and sum goes to 9. We hit the end of the loop and spin back up to execute the code again. Loop equals loop plus minus 1. The range indicates that we're going to subtract 1 every time through the loop. So loop comes to the value 1. Well, when loop equals 1, is it in range from 4 to 1? The answer to that is false. Remember, the top of the range, the end of the range, is not included. We exclude the 1. So when loop equals 1, we are a false statement. The loop is in range is a true-false question. 1 in the range from 4, 3, 2 is definitely false. We are going to leave the loop, and that's what this arrow is showing you. Once they are out of range, we exit the loop and execute the code after the for loop, the non-indented code after the for loop. There you have it. There's an example of a for loop. The 2 major loops in Python are the for loop and the while loop. Depending on what you're coding, you'll use one or the other. It's important to know both of them, though. The break statement. This is another control flow statement. Anything that controls the path of the code. Anything that determines what executes next is a control flow statement, and the break statement definitely qualifies. It basically means break out of the loop. If a break executes inside a loop, you are breaking out of the loop. We'll go straight to a programming example. We'll initialize our loop iteration variable to 8, and you'll see an 8 shows up in our iteration variable. What does the iteration variable mean? It means this is a variable that controls the loop, how many times it will execute. 8 greater than or equal to 0 is a true statement. Whenever the loop evaluates to true, we are going inside the loop and executing the code inside the loop. We will execute all of this indented code. Notice how we have a much more code in here. I kind of like this example. You could have 1 line of code inside a loop, 2 lines of code, 4 lines of code like this one. We are going to execute all this indented code inside the loop. If loop equals 5, well, 8 equal 5 is a false statement. So as we always do with false, we will skip the indented code. We'll print another loop. Sort of a rhetorical question. Do you want to spin in the loop again? Loop equals loop minus 1. There's nothing that says loops have to go forward, 1, 2, 3, 4. Loops can go backwards, 8, 7, 6, 5. What happens when we reach the end of the loop? When we reach the end of the loop, it's time to spin back up and do it again. So let's go back up to the while statement and evaluate it again. Now the loop variable contains the value 7, so 7 greater than or equal to 0 is still a true statement. As a true statement, we will execute the loop again. If loop equals 5 evaluates to 7 equal 5, and that is definitely false, they don't match. So we will skip the indented code in the if statement and continue on with the rest. Print another loop on the output, and you can see it shows up down here just fine. We're still executing all the indented code, so we'll go to the next line and say loop equals loop minus 1, and we'll update this variable to 6. Hit the end of the loop. What do we do at the end of every loop? We spin back up and try it again. With the value 6 in the variable loop, this evaluates that 6 greater than or equal to 0, which is still a true statement. As a true statement, we'll go inside the loop. 6 equal 5 is still false. Since it's still false, we will skip past the indented code and go on to the next line. Print another loop on the output, and it shows up just like we expect down here. And we're inside the loop executing all the indented code, so loop equals loop minus 1 puts a 5 in that variable. Things are about to change, people. It's getting close, not quite there. Spin back up at the end of the loop and execute the while loop again. This evaluates the 5 less than or equal to 0. That is a true statement. As a true statement, we will at least try to execute the loop again. However, if loop equal 5 now evaluates the 5 equal 5, which is a true statement. When it's true, we will go inside the if statement and execute the code inside the if statement. And it's a break statement, and it literally means break out of the loop. When this line of code executes, we will break out of the loop and leave the loop. That means these two lines here and here, they skip. You're going to skip all the rest of the code in the loop and exit the loop. This literally means break out of the loop. And the loop is done. It's over. If a break statement shall execute in the middle of a loop, the loop is done. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Your loop is over as soon as the break statement executes. Next up, the continue control flow statement. Again, any statement that alters the path that the program takes, that controls the flow of the program, is a control flow statement. And a continue statement, like its brother, the break statement, does control the path the program takes. The continue statement, like its brother, the break statement, does alter the loop. It's a control flow statement. We'll set up some more code, see how it works. We'll set a max variable equal to 0, and you can see a 0 shows up in my max variable. CTRL, short for control, is going to be the variable that controls the loop. It's often called the iteration variable. Some people call it the control variable. I did CTRL, short for control. This variable will control the loop. Control equals 1. Range indicates start at 1. Stop before we reach 5, and change by 1. Since we didn't tell it what to change by, it will change by 1. Is control equal to 1 in range from 1 to 5? And it certainly is. 1 is in range from 1 to 5. Remember, when your range ends at 5, you exclude 5. So this is a true statement. If this is true, what does that mean? We will execute the code inside the loop. Inside the loop, if control equals 2 or control equals 4, well, that's 1 equal 2 or 1 equal 4. That is a false statement. Both sides of this or are false. So this overall thing is false. We will skip past the indented code and go to the next line of code inside the loop. Max equals max plus 3. We'll bump max to 3, and we'll hit the end of the loop. When we hit the end of the loop, there's sort of an invisible trampoline there at the bottom, right there. When we stop with the indented code, we jump back up and execute the for loop again. Control equals control plus 1 or 2. Range indicates change by 1, so control will go to the value 2. Is control equal to in range? Well, here's 2 in our control variable. Is that in range from 1 to 5? That is a true statement. We are in range. Because we are in range, we will go inside the for loop and execute the code in the for loop. Is control in range is a true-false question. 2 is in the proper range, so it is true, and we will execute the code. 2 equal to 2 is a true statement. Uh-oh. See this big if statement here? Is this side true? Is that side true? Well, this side is definitely true. So true or false is a true statement. So we are going to go inside the code and execute what's inside the if block. And that's the continue statement. Some people call the continue a soft break because it lets you kind of restart the loop and try it over again. So what the continue statement will do is say go back up to the for loop and do it again. Return to the top of the loop to test the condition again. Skip this line of code. Anything below the continue statement will not execute. So continue will take us right back to the for loop. Now, when we get to the for loop, if it's still true, we'll spin in the loop. Control equals control plus 1. Whenever we reach this point in the code, we change control to be the next item in the range. Range indicates change by 1. We've gone to a 3. Is control equal to 3 in range from 1 to 5? That is a true statement. We are in the proper range, so we will return a true. If it is true, we are going inside the loop. Is control in range is a true-false question. 3 is in the proper range, so we will execute the code in the loop. Once we get inside the loop, the if statement is now false. 3 equal 2 is false, and 3 equal 4 is false, so we will skip past the if statement and go to the next line of code inside the loop. The next line of code will say max equals max plus 3 and change our max variable to 6. At the end of the loop, we always spin back up and do it again. We'll bump control to the next item in the range. Control equals control plus 1. It goes to a 4. Range indicates change by 1, so we'll just bump control by 1. Is control equal 4 in range from 1 to 5? That is a true statement. 4 is in the proper range. That is a true statement. That means we execute the code inside the for loop. However, the if statement now becomes true. 4 equal 2 is false, or 4 equal 4. Well, this side is now true. Since this side is true, the overall OR is true. So we will execute the code in the if statement. We will hit the continue again. Return to the top of the loop to test the condition again. That means we will skip this line below it. This line here does not execute. We will go from the continue back to the for loop. When we get back to the for loop, we will just bump control to the next item in range. Range indicates change by 1. Control plus 1 equals 5. And we bump the control variable to 5. However, this time control equal 5 in range from 1 to 5, that is a false statement. Remember, the range statement always excludes the last number. Since it excludes 5 from the range, 5 is not in range. This is a false statement. As a false statement, we will exit the for loop. We will go to the code below the for loop that is not indented and continue to execute code. Is control in range is a true-false question, and this time 5 is in range is a false statement. Leave the loop. There you have it. That's the continue statement. Continue and break are very related. Break is a hard exit for the loop. Continue is what we call a soft exit for the loop. Continue says we may continue spinning in the loop, but as you saw in that last case, we may not. Woohoo! That's it for this lesson. Have a good day. We'll see you on the next one.